Florida Republican lawmaker Byron Donalds held a town hall on Tuesday where he was asked about the Honoring Our PACT Act, which President Biden just signed into law. The long-awaited Honoring Our PACT Act promises to provide veterans with health care they need after being exposed to toxic burn pits. Donalds decried the PACT Act, claiming it wasn't actually about burn pits themselves, as there were many extraneous factors in the bill.
The next question, well, it's early, just a statement, but burn pit issues. That's a
Yes.
big conversation right now,
Yes.
so commentary on that.
Well, I mean, look, it's going to get signed into law at some, I believe, pretty soon by the president.
Can you explain it for those of us who are not familiar?
Well, the big issue that happened in the Senate was there was an agreement on burn pits overall. Like most things in Washington, the issue wasn't actually burn pits themselves. It was how are you going to actually classify it, how are you going to pay for it, and then are you going to dump a bunch of other stuff into the bill. So there was a bill that went through the House earlier this year. I voted against that version of it because there was a ton of other stuff that was in that bill that had nothing to do with burn pits. And you sit there, you're looking at it, and it's like, well, yes, we should cover this, but we should pay for that. But all this other stuff, why is this in there? So you had a lot of members on my side of the aisle who were quite upset that they added in a bunch of other stuff into a bill that everybody virtually had agreed on. That bill, the original bill, was actually classified as discretionary spending. I'm gonna come back to that in a moment. It passed out of the House. It got tied up in the Senate because the Senate also agreed there's a bunch of stuff that the House members put in that didn't make any sense. Why was it a part of it? So the Senate came up with a different version of the bill, still covered burn pits, but what happened was, in the Senate, they tied, let me back up. A new version of the bill came back in the House later, a couple months ago, I think it was like July. A different version came through. I voted for that version. The one concern about that version I had was they took out a bunch of the side stuff that was ridiculous, but they now made it mandatory spending. The difference between discretionary and mandatory is that under discretionary spending, every year Congress has to authorize the spending. Because Congress can look at the program and say, okay, is this thing way out of control? Do we gotta put new controls on it? Do we gotta examine it? Whatever the case might be. But it's a congressional approved spending matter every year we go through. Typically, it will probably end up falling into the National Defense Authorization Act, and we would look at it every single year. I didn't agree with the mandatory spending piece of it because, frankly, about 75% of the federal budget is now under mandatory spending. What that really means is no member of Congress really examines the mandatory side. We just treat it like it's golden and it's sanctified, and we only argue over the 25%. But I voted for it because burn pits are a serious issue. They got rid of a bunch of the other junk, but I didn't agree with the mandatory spending piece. It goes to the Senate. The Senate Republicans were actually, who were on board with burn pits as long as it was discretionary spending, they actually rejected the mandatory spending piece. There was a huge budget fight, so it came out in the media that the Republican members don't support veterans. No. The issue is, are you going to classify it as mandatory spending? And the problem we have in DC long term is that if we continue to classify everything as mandatory, then we'll come to a time period where we can't make the payments on burn pits. We can't make the payments on this. We can't make the payments on that because there's no fiscal discipline. It's not like you don't, it's not to say that we don't want to take care of it. You do, but there has to be budgetary soundness that happens every single year, so Congress is actually monitoring the checkbook to make sure you got the resources to do the things that you committed to in previous years. That was the issue in the Senate. I think they finally worked that piece out, so the president will be signing it at some point. I think with specifically the burn pits issue, the members all virtually universally agree. We should be covering that. There's no reason why, if we have members of our military that were exposed to toxic substances in the path of their service, that we would not cover that. That doesn't make any sense at all. The question is, well, how do you pay for it? And like the how you pay for it part, that's got to be worked out. It just has to be worked out. You can't get around it. And I think that, you know, the biggest thing I would try to say is, from a political perspective, it's easy to just be like, you don't support this person. That's not necessarily true. The question is, what is the consistent way you can actually continue to take care of the situation versus just throwing it against the wall and wishfully thinking that you can just do it without a plan for how you can consistently do it over the long term.
So along the same lines with conversations of contaminants exposed to,
Yeah.